Hello and welcome to Workforce Wisdom. I'm your host, Christy Bray, Chief Customer Officer at PracticeLink. This podcast explores the latest trends in healthcare recruitment, highlighting innovative strategies, success stories, and fresh perspectives that are transforming the healthcare workforce. These episodes will lead to in-depth, thoughtful discussions with recognized industry-leading healthcare professionals, exploring the challenges of healthcare recruitment and beyond. Whether you're an experienced recruitment professional or just starting out, this podcast aims to help you discover how experts are reshaping the industry, leveraging technology, and fostering inclusive hiring practices. Today's episode, Driving Provider Recruitment Innovation with Rupinder Kaur. Welcome, Rupinder.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you. Rupinder currently serves as the Executive Director for Physician and APC Recruitment at Baptist Health. Her areas of responsibility include provider recruitment strategy for 8 hospitals. She's been in the industry for over a decade and holds an MBA in healthcare administration and a bachelor's degree in biology. She enjoys bringing patient access to underserved communities in the Commonwealth of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. She resides in Louisville, Kentucky with her husband and 3 children. Welcome again. I'm excited for this episode today.
Yeah, same here.
So walk us through your career path and what inspired you to enter healthcare recruitment, and maybe what are some of the pivotal moments you've had along the way?
In my undergraduate studying, I wanted to do healthcare. That's why my background's in biology, and I really enjoyed a lot of my classes. But very soon I learned I'm not built for patient care, direct patient care. So I needed to find something else, but I was on this path with a part-time gig in banking, and I kind of stuck to that, not knowing what I want to do. And it really wasn't until I started my MBA and one of the professors with our healthcare class really started to dissect my background, my career choices, and over the span of 2 years worked very closely with me on my personality and traits and strengths, and recommended I work in an industry where it's really about relationship building and connections. So that's really what got me going into the space with healthcare recruiting, and that was kind of my capstone project. I found it really challenging, but I liked that every day wasn't the same. So I kind of enjoyed that piece, where banking is also very structured and rigid, and you're in the office 9 to 5, and those typical banking hours that are true. And so I liked the flexibility. I was a young mom at that point too, so the flexibility was great. So that's what got me started. What really got me to kind of deepen my roots was working for an organization here in Louisville, where I got to recruit for 5 hospitals, including adult and pediatric subspecialties, as well as work a little bit into the academic space. And I think just the diversity there in academic versus community medicine, pediatric versus adult, I felt like I was learning something new every single day, and that kept me really, really charged up. So from that trajectory, I found my path here at Baptist Health. So over the last few years, that's where I've kind of grown into this space.
That's interesting. You did some capstone work in recruitment. I think a lot of people that I interview or that we know in the industry, I always say we didn't go to recruiter school, but that's interesting. You recognized that early on as something that you were passionate about and enjoyed doing.
Yeah, I think a lot of it did also, I read this quote somewhere and it stuck with me for so many years. Sometimes people see things in you that you don't see in yourself, and you got to pause and shift that lens and try to, put on different lens and see yourself from other people's perspective. And that's what helped me understand that it was either matchmaking or recruitment. And I think they can be interchangeable in some ways. Recruitment just probably has more stability and longevity. Matchmaking would have been fun too. And still some of it is that. But how do we turn it into a business? How do we turn it into a discipline? That was the kind of the fun part. And it was nice to be able to build that foundational blocks to understand. So it's almost like I was teaching myself and learning as I went. And I've had good mentors along the way to help me.
Yeah, that's great. As you look back at some of the early days in the industry, what are some of the key lessons that shaped how you approach talent acquisition and recruitment strategy today? And definitely the first work you were doing within those PED subspecialties is so challenging. So I'm sure there were a lot of good lessons you've learned.
One thing I learned was how different academic medicine is from community medicine, and that includes the selection and the criteria. Overall, the recruitment process itself is very different. How you collaborate with physician leaders in the academic space, a lot of data driven, a lot of research driven, a lot of publication driven even, and understanding what that means and understanding the value behind that, because it is sometimes in a non-clinical space, and having respect for that value when you speak to it or you're speaking to someone around it, I think was something that I learned around that space. One of my favorite questions to ask every physician back then and even now is, what made you pick the specialty you chose? Like, did something speak to you? Was there a significant event in your life or throughout your journey in med school? And that's always such an amazing answer. And that's helped me understand the different specialties as well, because a lot of times, if there wasn't a significant event, it was a very dynamic case that they saw during med school or observations or residency that made them pick a certain fellowship or a certain discipline, and like their thought process behind it. And not being a clinician myself, it's helpful to see that passion come through, which was, I think, when we recruit for physicians, we're looking for that passion, that energy, their ability to serve, and we allow our physician leaders to check for that clinical aptitude. Very early on, I think a lot of focus was around CVs and references, and it was almost like a mold. Do they fit this mold? I think COVID changed. Our industry looks very different. Our process looks very different. I think 5 years ago, 10 years ago, an initial Zoom interview was unheard of in the healthcare space, maybe in tech and other industries, but definitely not in a physician recruitment space. So that's kind of become an industry standard. So we've changed. And then how do you pick up on the body cues and other cues that we're used to picking up on through the interview process by sitting next to a physician or across the room for a physician? How do you learn to do that virtually is something that's changed, several years ago versus now. And then it's, again, kind of relearning our industry and then also being part of that change. My favorite thing back then and even now is looking for hobbies on the CV and leading with that, because it's always helped. Physicians are human beings, so they're nervous when they're coming in for an on-site and an interview, and it's always helped them relax because they get to speak about something that's fun to them, that they're passionate about, and it's a good way to start their day and get them going. So that's kind of been how I've approached it before and even now in all these changing times.
We found that with our first Practice Fund scholarship applications. That's one of the questions we ask. And it's been just such a fun experience to read those questions. You're right. It just ignites something in them when you ask them it's basically asking them the why. Why did you go into medicine? And you get some heartbreaking answers, but you definitely learn a lot about their path and why they chose to. It's tough to become a doctor, but why they chose to stay on that path and be able to provide that care in those communities. So I'm sure over your career, you've had lots of projects or initiatives that you've been able to lead, but has there been one or two that have been really rewarding to you so far? And maybe tell us why.
I think one of them is just with Baptist, there are 8 hospitals, a couple that are, I would say, larger markets, but majority are smaller markets. Maybe rural would be the right word for a couple of them. There's a lot of education we've put in place over the last several years on how to select the right candidate, how to interview the candidate. We've streamlined a project that I worked on that I'm really proud of, and my team's done a lot of the heavy lifting here, so I got to give them that credit too, and a shout out. How do you streamline the recruitment process? I think a lot of times in these markets, they're very warm and joyful about a physician coming on site. So the entire village can be the welcome committee, which is very overwhelming and maybe sometimes sending out desperate vibes. So even though they have really good intentions, how do we streamline that? So we've, in one of our markets, started to pilot a program that's worked really well for them, where each leader is paired with a physician leader, and we broke down the site visit into segments, and everyone's designated a segment so that we're not asking tell me a little bit about yourself again. A candidate doesn't get that question 10 times throughout, 4 hours. So it's a very meaningful touch point. And in order to be as organized, we do a site visit prep meeting so everyone understands their role. And, schedules are going to vary. And sometimes someone gets to focus on one discipline, and then the next site visit, based on the candidate and schedule, they might focus on a different discipline. But this way we're making sure, we identified key metrics. This is what we want to cover in the site visit. And then everyone has a role, so they get to be a part of it, but not 20 people in one room and facing a candidate. So we streamlined that, and I'm really proud of that project. And I think it's helped us deliver better site visit experience to the candidate, because at the end of the day, it's about the candidate and making sure that we can bring on a right fit to serve the patients. But it's actually, we're tracking our conversion ratio. It's actually expedited our recruitment process from site visit to extension of a term sheet or an LOI to acceptance of a term sheet or an LOI, because we've taken out so much of that fluff and the minutia.
Right. A lot of times the expense of the site visits, the candidate coming on site, maybe not locally, you're flying them in, the hotel, the entertainment, bringing a spouse, maybe their family, all of that expense gets looked at in a different way, sometimes in a negative way, where now you're able to show we took the time to make sure that investment really does pay off in what you said. You're monitoring, does that help us close and get these positions filled faster, these commitments, set faster? It makes perfect sense to me that you would take the time to prep and unpack some of that in advance of spending the money and bringing somebody in who, you want to make the best of their time and the best of your time, that your leaders that you're involving in the process.
Yeah. I've been really proud of the leaders I've worked with for how engaged they've been and how open they've been to streamlining and not take personal offense when we've asked them to sit something out because we've had too many hands on deck, knowing that, they'll be included at a future site visit. Because a lot of times, again, the enthusiasm's there and they're very proud of their community and want to showcase it. And you're like, we just can't have 20 people at lunch and poor old candidate is sitting across from you and feeling, can't relax. So
yes,
very proud of the team overall.
Yeah. I think remembering, put yourself in the candidate's shoes, that if you were walking into an interview, a lunch, any of that, and you were, 1 to 20, even 1 to 10, that is a pretty intimidating environment. So you just have to think about that within your interview process. You don't want to leave people out, like you said, from the organization, to give them the chance. But you have to really remember the candidate. I would always ask my teams, if you're picking them up at 7 or 8 in the morning from the hotel, they're spending all day, right? And, including lunch, maybe even breakfast, maybe a dinner by the time they get back to their hotel room at 10 o'clock at night. What pieces of the community have they been able to see? And it's a lot. It's a lot of on time when you are kind of being run around through those things, where give them a little bit of time to explore the community on their own, or those other types of things where it's just not stacked full from an agenda standpoint.
Yeah, or even built in a designated break, 15 minutes, check your phone, go use the bathroom, sit in silence, whatever you need to do, like a couple human breaks, 15 minutes spread throughout the day, it makes a long difference, again, in the quality of the site visit. And most of the post-site visit surveys that I receive really give my site visits, our team's site visits, stellar reviews, because we just factor in that there are human beings and we're on, most recruiters are on throughout the day, but that means the candidate's also on, and gives them a moment to just unplug for a minute and sit in silence or not, or have a drink of water or close their eyes, whatever they need to do to rezone before the second half of the day or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's great. I think the key there is you're tracking it. You're doing prep work, but you're also tracking how successful the team is with this change that probably was a little painful, it sounds like, but that you got through that change and you've been able to prove to leaders why it's valuable, the work that you're doing. How do you approach mentoring or developing that next generation of recruiters and leaders and maybe on your sourcing team? But how do you approach that with a dispersed team that's working across a couple of states?
So I actually physically make quarterly visits to each market. So when I'm in that market, I meet with my team member one-on-one. In addition to that, I meet with my team member virtually. We typically have bi-weekly check-ins or as needed. I'm accessible by text or phone call anytime. I think a lot of the coaching and the mentorship depends on what they need, and recognizing each individual's strengths and traits and areas of opportunities, and really focusing on the top one or two. You can't be everything to everyone, and understanding, what are their goals and where do they want to go. And in the past, I've had a recruiter come to me and said, I really want to understand operations. Could I shadow someone on the ops team for a couple hours a day or whatnot? And, I've been very open to that, to help identify someone on the ops team that they could shadow to help them understand. And really, I wanted to speak to them after that shadowing experience, like what was kind of the takeaway. And I think they wanted to understand from a recruiting standpoint, how does the other side look at the recruitment experience? And I thought that was such a cool approach that even I didn't think of. And I was like, that's amazing. That's awesome. So it's like, everyone's so different and has a very different outlook and perspective. So, and, being able to cater to that. And it's almost like as leaders, we have to be chameleons and adapt to whatever audience we're speaking to and understanding their needs. But a lot of and I do go to the career fairs and conferences with individual team members. And a lot of times that coaching and mentorship happens organically, whether it's through a candidate we've spoken to or an experience. Sometimes setting up the booth, you plan, and we have an amazing team member that helps us with site visit conference logistics. And, your furniture isn't there, or the booth is set up, but the carpet's not there. And you're like, I paid for this. And they're like, no, you didn't. And, working through that, knowing that your flight was delayed, here you are, everything was supposed to be perfectly set up and it's not, and you're hungry, you're tired, and working through something like that, sometimes that, that could be a coaching moment too. And just being prepared. I always encourage my team, like we've got various team members that we lean on for various functions, but it's always good to take a moment to zone yourself, be prepared. I always pull a packet together, whether it's a physical packet or a digital packet, depending on, what the situation is, every time before our conference. So I know my booth number, I know where I am, I know what we've paid for, and I have receipts and copies of everything handy, because a lot of times you show up on a Saturday morning because the conference is going to start Saturday night or Sunday morning. You don't want to bother your team member on the weekend. So you're like, I gotta tackle this on my own. So little things like that, where you could, work through that. Difficult conversations, critical conversations is a situation, recruitment is typically a very political space. We're kind of the broker between the medical group and the hospital and the candidate. And there's delicate conversations and critical conversations that we're constantly navigating. And I'm the sounding board with my team for those. So again, coaching happens organically through those platforms. So I think it's just, I take what they come to me with and see where I could help them grow and expand their thought process.
Hope you're enjoying today's podcast. Just wanted to break in here to remind you of PracticeLink's new Physician Resource Center at PracticeLink.com. To check out our Physician Resource Center, head over to PracticeLink.com today. PracticeLink's Physician Resource Center is a collected hub of content which includes valuable resources and information about contracts and compensation, the job search and interview process, quality of life and wellness, and many, many more areas designed specifically to inform and support physicians' professional growth and success. To check out our Physicians Resource Center, head over to PracticeLink.com today. Thank you for listening, and now we'll return to the podcast.
When you have maybe new people to healthcare, not just the recruitment industry, what's the best way that you kind of give them a crash course in the acronyms, the specialties? I know in the past I've encouraged folks go shadow the physician or the APP, whatever it might be, if they weren't familiar with that specialty. Is that something you've done in the past, or how do you kind of tackle that when you've got somebody brand new to just healthcare as an industry?
Oh gosh, so majority of my team came from a non-healthcare background. I hired the individual, and I was like, I can teach, recruiting is coachable, it's teachable. What I can't teach is work ethic, competency, personality, how do you pivot from critical conversations, work discipline, things of that nature. So those were kind of the qualities I was looking for. So majority of my team is not from the healthcare background. So the way I approached that was, just doing a crash course, starting with one specialty, primary care, talking through that, looking at CVs. I also encourage them to go to typically like the board's website, but also there's so many good YouTube videos and resources out there, even social media. There's a lot of cool content out there. And then when you get into the surgical space, I've said, you don't have to be the expert, but you need to be familiar with terminology. YouTube that surgery. If someone's an endovascular neurosurgeon, what does that mean? Go ahead and Google that and Google a surgery and get a feel for what happens in the OR. Obviously, they're open to going into the OR and observing should they wish to. So we have those options. Same thing with the APP world, understanding. We actually also do conversations with the NP and PA programs locally. So they get to talk to students and understand their journey. Same thing with medical schools and residency programs. So I think it's a little bit less intimidating if you can make that human connection one-on-one. And then a lot of shadow time. We'll shadow recruitment dinners, we'll shadow site visits, we'll go through a site visit itinerary. For cardiology looks very different for endocrinology. And why are they different? Because the disciplines are different. What could be important for a surgical visit versus a non-surgical visit? So it's a lot of on-the-job learning and case by case, but you kind of start small and build up versus go recruit for every specialty at every location, just, throw in the deep end. We haven't quite really done that.
Yeah. And it can be tough that some of the specialties, especially the surgical specialties, those candidates can be really tough. You've got a new person without a lot of knowledge. Those physicians can kind of be mean on the interviews and definitely challenge, the person. They challenge everybody, I think, but they could challenge that new team member in a way that turns them off from the job to be done.
Yeah, I agree. And I think certain specialties have a stereotypical personality type. And we do coach them. I coach them through that. And I've shared what my favorite specialties to work with are. And I said, once you got a few months under your belt and maybe a couple years, you too will have some favorites. And there'll be different reasons why they're favorite, And so, yeah, we talk to it's like the little nuances in each area. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. What challenges is your team seeing, or are you seeing, broadly across the country, that are the most pressing? And how do you think, or what would be your guidance for how the industry addresses those challenges?
I think right now our biggest demand for a state that's not as sexy as California, New York, Florida is supply and demand. There's a finite amount of candidates interested in coming to Kentucky. Several are those that are from Kentucky that want to come back, or Southern Indiana. But we're all fishing from the same pond. Folks recruiting to New York are fishing from the same pond. Folks recruiting to, those like what I call sexy states we're all fishing from the same pond, and that pond's got a very limited amount of candidate pool. So that supply and demand's tough right now. And then you factor in urban versus rural market, that pool just went down from, I think I did the math for one specialty one time, and there were literally 7 candidates out there available and who've identified themselves as interested in coming to Kentucky. 7 in one specialty out of hundreds in training and thousands practicing. So that's our main challenge when we go out and recruit, and which is why we have a strong career fair and conference strategy, is we can't post and pray and wait for them to come to us. We go out there and proactively network and talk to candidates. And we celebrate when we sign a candidate from a conference or a career fair, because you got to recognize the effort, the time it took to just even convince someone to consider Kentucky that's never stepped foot in Kentucky or Indiana. And it's a beautiful state. I think there's just a bias out there. It's like we celebrate the site visit. I'm like, great. You had a meaningful conversation that was valuable enough to them. They found the practice opportunity to be a valuable match, that they came on site. That is a win itself. And then you celebrate if they sign. Oh my gosh. We don't open champagne bottles, but virtually we open champagne bottles. In theory, we do. The budget doesn't really permit that. Another challenge I think right now is the shift in the workforce that's graduating. Their work ethic looks very different than the graduating class 10 years ago. And our administrators and our physician leaders are not ready for that. And they're not ready to accept that. And, I was actually talking to a senior leader within the organization yesterday. We were speaking about one particular physician that's nearing retirement. And I said, I think we need to hire 3 physicians to replace this one physician because of how her scope of practice was versus what the current workforce that's graduating and available, and it's not right or wrong. It's just a factual thing to have to work through, which means benefits need to be reevaluated. There's a lot of downstream that happens when you go speak to a candidate and they don't want to work more than 3 days a week or 4 days a week. And that's not the industry norm in the past, but it's becoming the industry norm going forward. And then you've got a blend of partners who've worked 5 days a week, 50 to 60 hours a week. And that's a standard, or it's a norm because they were in private practice before they became employed. And they are going to be retiring, and they're not sometimes always enthusiastic about having a new partner that wants to come in and dictate a 3.5-day work schedule because they feel like we didn't have, it's an imbalance, and it's no one's right, no one's wrong. It's just, this is the direction we're moving in. I think those are really our top 2 challenges within our industry that we're kind of, at Baptist trying to solve for: the supply and demand, and how do we meet the needs of this workforce that's coming? How do we get ahead of it too? And I don't know about you and your team, but we're hearing a lot of job share. That's a new one for us. Mm-hmm. We're trying to figure that out too.
Yeah. And I think the way to figure out if it is job share or, their expectation for their work schedule, what I have found is those that new graduating class, they're willing to accept less money for having the lifestyle or that schedule that works for them and their families. So I think that's something to understand, that not all of these things can be fixed with paying them more. If we pay them more, then they will want to work 50, 60 hours. Not true. I mean, you definitely are seeing a lot of primary care folks come out. They want a 0.8 or they want a 0.6, and they're okay with the compensation change because they know that's what they need personally to survive and to continue to enjoy practicing medicine. So yeah, it's going to be a struggle. I don't think healthcare is the only industry like that, where you just see a different generation or a different mindset in terms of their work style or their work schedule. It's not that they're less committed. They are equally committed to, I think they've seen what has happened to the previous workforce and their lives and their health and how imbalanced it is. So I think they're just putting themselves first, which is okay. That's probably what a lot of us should be doing. So
I feel like that passion and dedication is there. It's just, they've got different priorities. And again, like to your point, that's okay. We just have to solve for that.
So we know that technology is changing not only recruitment, but everything we do day to day, specifically AI. But how have you leveraged some tech innovations in your team or your own work to drive better outcomes?
Gosh, I think we are dabbling more and more in AI and trying to figure that out. How do we lean on it in a smart way? I myself lean on Microsoft Copilot probably daily, if not multiple times a day. It's helped me be more efficient. And then I pass that, I share that with my team, whether that's creating a job posting or responding to a candidate communication or internal communication. Just being able to have that resource at hand has been helpful. I am curious and excited to see where this space goes because I think we've barely scratched the surface. Baptist itself is not a big innovative organization. I think we're slow and steady. We don't jump on the first big sexy thing. I wish sometimes we would, but we don't. But when we do jump on the bandwagon, we typically invest in kind of the biggest, shiniest, object out there for that discipline. So I am excited to see, we were one of the first states to pilot DAX in Epic, which is an AI generated tool to help alleviate some of the charting, after hours charting off the physicians to help increase physician engagement and help with some physician burnout. One of the physicians I was speaking with at the recruitment dinner last night actually told me how he's been able to lean on in primary care. It's interesting, some of the things that he's shared with me. I was like, I didn't even think about that. He said in primary care, a patient is pointing their finger at their shoulder and says it hurts here, and DAX can't pick that up. So I have to remind myself to repeat, oh, it helps on your left shoulder, upper shoulder, little things like that I'm excited that Baptist is able to make that available to our physicians. It's available throughout the system. After the pilot, we worked through some feedback and challenges and helped streamline that, worked with Epic on that. So that's one example of where we've leaned on technology to kind of, improve as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that will become just like putting your EMR, what is your EMR, putting that in your job descriptions or your job postings, things like that, DAX, other innovations that will just help streamline the process or make their time, help them to be more efficient with their time management. I think all of that is going to become kind of a competitive edge for those health systems willing to go in and evaluate the tech and then do the investment in what's going to make their work life easier.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's interesting to see because everybody leans on it differently too. It's interesting to see where we go in that space. It's exciting, really.
Yeah, definitely exciting. And it's changing so fast compared to we may have moved things a little bit. Now it feels like it's very, very big steamroll coming along. So
it's kind of like, I think Ken said this in Boston. He was like, it's like the internet, like learning the internet all over again. I was like, oh my gosh, that makes exact sense, actually. That's a good way to put it.
Yes. Yeah. I am old enough to have clearly remembered the internet being invented and getting your very, very first email address. So it's just lightning fast these days.
Yeah.
Compared to that. But
yeah.
If you could change one thing about healthcare recruitment, kind of that process, if you could change one thing tomorrow, what would it be and why?
Going back to my biggest problem that we need to solve for supply and demand, I think if there's a way for us to advocate at the Capitol to open up more residency spots, that disproportion right now between medical school graduates and residency spots and the positions out there, or even pick the top 4 specialties, maybe have a top 5 specialties. I understand it's a large thing to fund, and that's a big ask, right? It's a lot of different players to bring to the table, and it's probably a 4 or 5 year plan to get that in place because you've got to have so many different disciplines together. But if I had a magic wand and could help fix something, I think that's the first thing I would want to help be part of, and help with legislation or give data or go, really, I don't mind going university to university and beg and plead if they would take on even, 5 additional residents to help open up more space. When you look at the match data, it's really, really deflating sometimes that someone's invested so much time and money and they didn't match, not because they did something, they were inept or inadequate. It was just, again, it's a numbers game. So if we could solve for that, that may put a little dent in our healthcare problem in the country. I think other thing that I would want to work on, which is more local to my community, is being more open-minded to physicians from different cultures and backgrounds. And also understanding that, that's an educational process that we're going through currently in some of our communities. Many of these foreign trained physicians had to compete with thousands, if not hundreds and thousands of people to get into medical school, to get into foreign training in their country. So when they come to the United States and go through an accredited residency program, they're typically at the top of their class. It's a good thing. We want to be open-minded, not saying we don't want to be open-minded, we want to be open-minded to those physicians. And I think if I could help with some of those biases, and we try to, get at that one day at a time, but that would help also fill some of the gap with access and bring patient access, because many times they do come from rural communities in their countries and they want to practice and have a passion for practicing rural communities, and that may be a good solution. It's not a solve all for everything, but that may be a one solution to help solve for some of the healthcare deserts and the gaps.
Yeah, there was an article this week in Modern Healthcare that really focused on a couple of health systems that are leaning into funding those extra slots themselves, just on their own, without being pushed, by the government or whoever to have that, to make that happen. And what they do within the article, they really put the dollars, the financial commitment that it requires to do that. It's very large, but you're right, that is the only way, unless we can open that up. Or a system that I supported previously, when they opened the medical school, they secured funding for those students. So when they graduated, they wouldn't have medical school debt, which is just huge. So beyond the debt factor, but then also it's super tough to match and move forward, et cetera. All of those things, we're just in this really bad perfect storm of the shortage and trying to see the light and dig our way out of that. It's just really, it's tough. There's a lot of angles that affect what's happening right now. So you talked a little bit about being more inclusive in the hiring practices. Is there some advice that you would share with recruiters or healthcare organizations more broadly that are seeking to build that more inclusive and equitable hiring practice, as you mentioned, related to IMGs, but overall, what advice would you give to folks?
I strongly feel like my litmus test has always been, is this a physician or an advanced provider I would want to take my family member to or go to myself? And I think if you lead with something in that realm, you automatically omit any kind of bias out there and create a very inclusive environment, because then you're really focusing on the fit. And again, what I coach my team on is get to know your candidate, get to know them really well, be an advocate for them, help them, because sometimes, and we're working through a situation now that's happened in a site visit in a market where actually I had the opportunity to work with this candidate myself 6-7 months ago, and then handed him off, where they made a comment during the site visit dinner that I think wasn't taken in the best way by the other partners. So if you know the candidate and know what context that may have been, then maybe it was taken out of context, being able to massage that situation and also realize that ultimately it's not our decision, were, again, just, advocating for the candidate, bringing the best candidate in. I think having multiple decision makers and stakeholders involved also creates a very inclusive environment. Different people may ask the same question, but may ask it in a different way and may receive the answer in a different way. And then having a collegial, collaborative panel to run through their own experience and feedback from the site visit to make a decision versus a decision maker, I think kind of, helps assure that it was a inclusive experience, which is what we strive for. So we have a blind survey after a site visit that the recruiter will send out to everyone that participated in the site visit. The recruiter is the only one who sees the feedback. And then we'll work with the stakeholders on next steps. So if majority are leaning towards making an offer to a candidate after a site visit, we try to do this within one business day because we're trying to get an offer out as quickly as possible to woo the candidate. But that way, other folks haven't seen what other folks have shared. If the majority is leaning in a different direction, then, the recruiter will pull the group together and say, here's some of the feedback I heard, and it's blind feedback. So no one can kind of, most people know what their comments were, but no one can really pinpoint. And that way, it also takes away some of the bias around the other decision makers and not sometimes, some people are shy about speaking openly because they're like, am I the only one who didn't want to make an offer or the only one wanted to, So it works. That blind survey really has worked well for us and help us also expedite that process. So I would give that feedback to others and as a strategy or as a tool is vet the stakeholders that need to be involved. Identify the right stakeholders. Again, get them organized, know what questions they need to be asking, because sometimes they don't, and that's okay. But also, the feedback should be blind, and it should be one individual that's unbiased, and recruiter could be that, or a recruiting coordinator, or someone, that is going to keep that confidential. And if there's any delta, any outlier, have a plan on how do you navigate that.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Yeah, the feedback thing is always interesting to me. I think until you've ever been in the unfortunate situation where your recruitment team, is being accused of, poor hiring practices, it really opens your eyes to some of that and those behaviors that you could and should take the time to correct, as you mentioned, coaching them on what should be asked and what shouldn't, but then and making sure you're removing as much bias as you can from the process. So I think that's key. I mean, I know probably when we both started in this industry, it was pretty common for candidates to send their picture. And I am very glad that has stopped because of those exact things that you talked about. You've already gone down one path just by seeing their picture, when you really should just be judging on the merits of their training and their experience within their CV.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, so as we wrap up, give us a little bit of inspiration. So how do you stay inspired and continue to grow professionally in a field that is constantly evolving and changing and moving at a very, very rapid pace?
I really look for inspiration within my team. When I see someone struggled with their site visit, you plan, and nothing went right, because that happens outside of your control, and how they come back from that or kind of help walk them through that. It works as a reminder for someone like myself who's not in the trenches anymore of how important what we do is. When I hear from a neighbor, a friend, a colleague, hey, I need to go see this specialist. Can you recommend someone? Who do you know? Or I went and saw this specialist and they were amazing. That inspires me. At the end of the day, what we do is to bring access to our communities, and I feel really good about that. How do I kind of continue to grow? I think we've gotten some platforms across the industry with continuing education, leaders such as yourself and others, asking for advice, asking for growth opportunities, really helps me continue to grow. Also not feel like I'm on an island, because sometimes that happens. So you just got to remind yourself, I'm in this today alone, but I'm in the grand scheme I'm not alone in this. And sometimes the responsibility is on you yourself to make some outreach and say, hey, could we grab coffee and talk through something, or jump on a Teams call or a Zoom call and ask for feedback or ask for advice or brainstorm together to help solve for something that maybe you're stuck on. I think we're blessed. Our industry's big, but not so big that we don't have meaningful connections across the country with leaders, people of the same career stage or, role as others. And I think a great thing about our industry is everyone's very open for sharing and collaborating. So I would say to anyone, my advice would be lean on someone. When you go to a conference, go meet someone that you haven't met before, shake their hand, introduce yourself, go grab coffee, whatever, a meal or whatever makes sense, go for a walk. I love a lot of these conferences now have yoga time and running time. I mean, the platforms are there. Take advantage of it, right? I say that when I'm antisocial a lot of times and don't do any of those things, but if I wanted to, I really would, and I should, and I will hold myself accountable and will do some of those in the next opportunity. But I just, none of that existed 5 years ago. The conferences did not have these type of avenues. So take advantage, get to know people. And there's a lot of cool people in our industry. And if you're listening to this and, connect with me and look up my email, rupinder.kaur@bhsi.com, and make a connection. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, no, and she does mean it. I know we both mean it. And it's been nice that you and I have over the years been able to collaborate on some projects and things. And it's special whenever people reach out or say, hey, do you have time? I think almost all of us will make the time, even if it's after hours or a weekend, just to help listen or try and solution with somebody and be that support for them. So I really appreciate that and appreciate having you on Workforce Wisdom today on behalf of PracticeLink. I want to thank you, Rupinder, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. For our listeners, I encourage you to explore the tools and resources available through the PracticeLink Resource Center, which supports both physicians, providers, and recruiters. I would love to hear from you, so share your thoughts, questions, or feedback about today's episode and visit practicelink.com or email us directly at plmedia@practicelink.com. Don't forget to subscribe to Workforce Wisdom on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen, so you never miss a conversation that inspires, informs, and helps transform the future of healthcare recruitment. Thanks again, Rupinder.
Thank you.
I'm Christy Bray, and this has been Workforce Wisdom. Thanks for listening.